Hi, welcome to the Learning Loop podcast. My name is Chris Ridding. I'm a postdoc in computer science at University of Washington, and Learning Loop is my contribution to the world, my effort to help us all improve our lives, our sense of meaning, our relationships, our productivity, and basically my approach is tackling the problem of forgetting. Specifically, I do this because I believe there's nobody who's better equipped to solve your problems and to answer your questions than you are, because you're the person who has access to your values, to your decisions, to your subjective experience, and you have a lot of experience and a lot of insight and a lot of things that you've learned and sound bites you've gotten from podcasts and quotes you've gotten from books. And nobody knows how it all fits together better than you. But you forget these important bits of knowledge. So the approach that I take to tackle the problem of forgetting is to help you iteratively learn by going through this loop of taking, organizing, and using your notes to help you remember and learn what matters most, so that you can stop forgetting what matters when you need to have not forgotten it. So as I go through each of these episodes, I'll look at Learning Loop, a different aspect of it, and apply it to a problem that I think we broadly as people face. And what you're supposed to do as a listener is pay attention to what ideas that you have for your own life, of what you should do more of, what you should do less of, what things and tips and tricks you should try implementing in your own life from what I'm talking about. So the problem that we're talking about today is using idle time to do what matters most. What is idle time? So here's your day, and you have a bunch of hours that I would call busy. It's when you're sleeping, it's when you're conversing with your spouse, it's when you're working, and you don't have a lot of spare cognitive bandwidth in that time. But you have the rest of your day where I would call it idle time, that you do have a lot of spare cognitive bandwidth. This is when you're walking the dog, this is when you're driving to the dentist, this is when you're washing the dishes, who knows. And there's a lot of variance in the kinds of things that you can do in that time, because oftentimes in this day and age, we can grow bored because we're used to always being entertained. And so, it's pretty common if I'm walking the dog for me to flip on a podcast or to turn on the latest Beyonce album or whatever. And my position these days is that we actually have a great variety of good to bad things that we could do with our idle time. And I don't want to be prescriptive about what you should do with your idle time, but I do think that you should be deciding what to do with your idle time. Because for me personally, I noticed that it's much, much easier for me to hand the reins over to somebody else, for them to decide what we'll be thinking about for this half an hour that I drive to the dentist, through a podcast, through an audiobook, etc., than me myself deciding, okay, here's a huge problem that I struggle with all the time. Let me think my way through this. Or here's a big research problem that I'm just really grinding on at work. Let me see if I can make any headway on this. Because the former is easy and the latter is difficult. But I think with the easier things, I have felt unfulfilled by kind of my excess consumption. And at the end of the day, contrary to what Robert Sapolsky would say, we do have free will and we are agents, and we could use that agency not only to consume, but also to produce. And at the end of the day, I would rather be a good brother than up to date on all of Beach House's latest music. And I would rather make progress in my career on hard technical problems than have listened to all of the breaking news on the daily podcast or something. And so my goal is to get you deciding how to spend your idle time by using your notes to write down the things that stress you out, that worry you, that deserve a lot of attention, that confuse you, and then organize your notes so that those problems, questions, saliencies are accessible to the you that has that idle time, so that then you can pull up those notes and use them as a resource of how to decide what to do with your idle time. So, as a demonstration of why I think it's justified to be very deliberate about choosing what to do with your idle time, imagine that you had some computer or some assistant track down everything that you ever said or everything you ever thought and came up with this histogram that represented what your modal or most common and least common thoughts are. And so I'm kind of just making this up, but let's say that, if the thought is one of these bars, the height of the bar is the percentage of your total thoughts that thought makes up. So here, in my contrived example, I've said that I hate my job is the most common thought that I have. And then it's followed by I miss my family because I moved away from them, and I'm excited to camp this weekend. And then it's I loved that concert. And these are my most common thoughts on the left. And then on my right, you have my least common thoughts, like this guy that I met at this conference one time in this one-off meeting is boring. Or this barbecue that I went to at Magnuson Park, one-off time, it's mediocre. These more common thoughts, they are impacting my day-to-day experience much more thoroughly, much more often. They're much more representative of the things that are causing me pain and the things that are causing me joy. And so I think that to use your idle time on these things as opposed to these things and not leave it up to chance makes a lot of sense, because then you can make progress on the things that bring you most pain and bring you most joy. So why do we need Learning Loop to talk about any of this stuff? Why am I not just saying be more deliberate? Why am I saying to do this through the lens of notes? Well, let me show you an example of, like, at its very simplest, what deciding how to use your idle time could look like through the lens of notes that would give you possibilities that you basically are guaranteed not to have if you're relying just on your brain and the natural way that you decide how to do what you do during your idle time. So imagine that I'm in Apple Notes and I just made a note, that's titled things to do about / do with idle time. And I have a category of things that I could do, like call a family member, and I have a category of things that I could think about, like where do I want to go on vacation this next summer, or what am I most grateful for and why, or what could I do to have a more fulfilling career. And then I also have these counts of the times that I've thought each of these thoughts or asked each one of these questions. So the number of times that I thought, where do I want to go on vacation this next summer, maybe that was 3. And maybe the number of times that I thought to myself, what could I do to have a more fulfilling career since I started this note, was 24. This would be a good indication that I should be thinking about what could I do to have a more fulfilling career during my idle time, because that's the thing that's bugging me most often. And I think that my position is that if you leave this up to chance, you will not have anything like these counts of, I thought about this bottom question 24 times, I thought about the middle question 8 times, I thought about the top question 3 times. The brain has this way of thinking, making the conscious mind believe that what it's thinking about right now is kind of like the entirety of the world. It's very hard to get over the idea that this is not what matters most and representative of the rest of your life. But there's a lot of variance in our experience. And so by writing down the things that we experienced yesterday, today, tomorrow, next week, next month, we can come up with this distribution of the things that really bother us or really make us happy. And these are the things that arguably deserve more of our idle time to think about than just throwing on a podcast or throwing on an audiobook that somebody happened to recommend to us. And this is like as simple as it gets, basically. A super easy note to keep that you could literally pull up every time you have idle time and decide, of these four things what you want to do. Obviously, if you did this in practice, there would be many more than four things, and you could have choice from many more options. And maybe eventually you decide that having so many options is overwhelming and daunting. So at that point, maybe you get rid of the things that have the lowest counts. Ugh. You get rid of the things that have the lowest counts, and you keep the things that have the highest counts because they matter most. So that's an example of what you can do to take notes, organize notes, and then use them to solve this problem of what to do with your idle time. I also want to show you what I do that's a little bit more complicated than this in a different note-taking app called Obsidian. So here we are on my daily notes, but I am sitting there asking what to do with my idle time. So I decide, you know what, I'm going to pull up this questions page that I have. And in the past, I've written down these questions to ask with idle time. Why do I feel so anxious every night when coming home from work? Can I stop feeling that? Or where do we want to go on vacation this next summer? Or what is a charity that I would feel really good about volunteering at? I've written these down explicitly in the questions page so I have access to them in the future. I've also tagged questions that I've asked in the past, like on May 1st, 2024, and on May 31st, 2024, about ask my dad how he answered questions before the internet, or should I evaluate how should I evaluate whether people are learning while using ChatGPT? I also tagged my research there. Or how can I show my son that I love him? Questions. So I have some research questions here. I have some personal questions. I have some relational questions. And this is a resource that I now can rely on when I'm asking myself what to do to fill the time in a way that's meaningful and rewarding. I also have this other page, a problems page. I feel so tired every morning when I wake up. And so this is a problem that I face, and I could ask myself what the reasons are that I face this problem, or what I could try to fix this problem. And I could even take into account this data that I wrote down on October 9th, or on February 2nd, or on January 5th. These data points that span the years that I never could have remembered otherwise, I now have access to because I've taken notes, I've organized them for a future me, and I've used them to solve a problem, which in this case is both what to do with my idle time and how to feel less tired every morning when I wake up. I also have a page which is literally called like things to think about and questions to answer with alone time and space. And so these are general questions that I could ask about any given day. Like, today would have been good inputs and outputs. That is, what good and bad things have happened this week, and what were the high value actions that caused them? Or what is the meaning of today? Obviously, the boundary between these pages, the questions and the problems and the things to think about pages, the boundaries are kind of porous. They're not like mutually exclusive things. There are questions, there are problems kind of scattered across all of them, and some of the problems could be phrased as questions, and some of the questions could be phrased as problems. But the idea is to have this robust foundation of resource, this full set of things that I could really worthily spend my time thinking about when I'm in the car, or when I'm cleaning my house, or whatever thing. This is solving two problems for me at one time. And I could just go on and on and on. I could look at my walk page, and the how-to section is going to tell me how to walk productively in ways that make walks really rewarding for me, as opposed to anxiety-inducing or unrewarding or boring. I could have a driving page that I have a how-to section there. And the through line in all of these situations is that I wrote down these things that I wanted to keep track of, like problems that I wanted to solve or questions that I wanted to answer, but I didn't have time right at that moment. I wanted to save it for a time where I had a little bit of time to think about it. So what better time than to think about it on my walk, or to think about it on my swim, or on my bike ride? That's the exact kind of problem that we're solving here with this approach. So you'll notice that that histogram that I wrote down and showed you a couple minutes ago, I don't have a version of that in my notes right now. But I have imagined extending my note taking practice to include that kind of thing. And maybe it's as simple as manually updating a counter every time I visit a page. That sounds kind of tedious. You could automate something like that, and I could display to myself kind of what the modal pages are that attract my most attention. I also, have thought about writing down, like I keep this pad of sticky notes in my side bag. Why don't I just write down some things to think about with my idle time and stick it on the back of my phone? Because oftentimes when I grab my phone, the thing I'm trying to solve is what to do with my idle time. And if instead I have this post-it that says, how are you going to evaluate whether ChatGPT is helping people or hurting people in their skill acquisition, then that might be a better way to use my idle time than whatever I was going to do on my phone. It's another example of taking notes, organizing them, and using them. I also could ask other people how they decide to think about what they think about when they have idle time, or do what they do when they have idle time. And I'm in general very curious to hear kind of like whether this is a problem for other people, whether other people take specific approaches, and whether they involve notes or not. So let me know if you have some consideration that I haven't considered, if you have some other take, if you think that this resonates. Please communicate with me. But in general, the thing that I think that we should do is ask what we're trying to accomplish. In this case, you ask, am I unsatisfied with how my idle time gets used? Or could I use my idle time better? And if the answer is no to both of those things, then maybe you don't need these tools. And good for you, because your nature's taking care of you. But for people like me that, waste an hour here, waste an hour and a half there, I would rather use that idle time in a way that's rewarding, that's fulfilling, and I think that we can do that through the learning loop approach. So thanks for tuning in for another episode of Learning Loop, and I'll see you next week.